Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Melissa Griffith. Melissa is a public policy fellow with the Science and Technology Innovation Program at the center. She's also a non-resident research fellow at the University of California's Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity and an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown's Center for Security Studies. She joins us today to talk about technology and national security. Melissa, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Speaking of your tenure with the Wilson Center, last week you moderated a panel on the digital divide, and I thought we could spend a little time on that before we segue over into the security issues. And one is, if I can ask you for a definition, people like you who are in the know, digital divide means all kinds of things. But for people, for the layperson, what are we talking about?
I think that's a fantastic question. It's actually at the root of why we organized that event. As I think when people think digital divide, they think singular, right? That there is one divide we are trying to solve, and that typically revolves around infrastructure. Do you have mobile connectivity, satellite connectivity, internet connectivity in those senses? And then can we solve that? So can you solve the singular divide? And what this event is actually doing is saying, no, that's an outdated definition of digital divide. We're actually dealing with digital divides, plural. And there's a variety of those. So if we really want to understand the policy packages, we need a better definition of the problem. So part of what we were doing kind of last week on this event was scoping that out. And you have these sort of foundational concerns around digital divide, which are actually not digital issues in and of themselves. These are questions of kind of power allocation. Do you have the energy required to be able to run an internet, for example, out of your system and the fiber? And then there's questions.
So power, you're talking about electricity when you say power, not political power.
Electricity. No, just electricity, which we don't typically think about when we talk about digital divides. This is something that sort of is a precursor, a necessary condition to a lot of the digital technology we talk about. So you have that category, electricity. Then you have a category up, which is just connectivity. And these are questions around internet connectivity, mobile connectivity. This is where conversations around 5G come in, or satellite. Do you have a connection? What's the speed, the low latency of that connection, the type, the quality? Then above that, you have this question.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, excuse me. I was going to ask a follow-up, but you finish first and then I'll ask you.
No problem. Yeah, we'll come back to that. So I think then there's this question of infrastructure. And then above that, you have this question of software, which I think is kind of a less understood area, particularly around as we think about machine learning and the types of data we use. Do we entrench divides there? Do we sort of leave certain groups out, train on only certain types of languages and not others when we do language translation? And then you have this kind of training or practice piece where it's sort of certain groups just not have access to it, even if it's in their area. Do they not know how to use it in a workforce environment? And that brings up real questions around gender diversity and gender equity, which was sort of another component of the panel. So I think it's a good question. We tend to think of digital divide as a simple answer, and in reality, it's a complex web of digital systems and the things that they rely on to function.
Is there any coherent response to this panoply of issues and problems that you described that add up to these divides, or is it just a patchwork quilt of whack-a-mole?
So
I'm mixing metaphors all over the place.
Yes, please. I wouldn't say it's necessarily whack-a-mole. I would say, like, if you were a policymaker or a person sitting in industry concerned with these issues, I think your first step is to understand across those layers we've just described, what's the state of play in the area you operate, right? Because you may be in an area where electricity is just not the issue. That's not the choke point. The choke point may be, and this is true for large parts of the United States, trained or skilled practice. Right? When we saw this big shift around COVID-19 to entirely virtual environments, I teach. I know a lot of other people do as well. That's a completely different process of teaching that a lot of people were not trained or equipped to handle. And that's not because the technology wasn't there, the skilled practice wasn't there yet. So I think if you're thinking about solutions, you look across this ecosystem of issues, and then you think about where your choke points are and how you better balance those different levels.
I think for the longest time when the question of digital divide came into play, other than the potential socioeconomic indicators, there was a lot of discussion about broadband access and a lot of discussion that the United States lagged behind in broadband access when you looked at the picture globally. Is that still the case?
Yeah, so I think particularly if you're comparing, depends which countries you're comparing to. The United States also has different problems than some other countries, right? I'm originally from New Mexico. This is an incredibly rural state. So when you're talking about access, specifically if you're talking about laying fiber, that's a very different proposition than, say, a Finland where the majority of their population is located in a couple of cities in the south of the country. Right. So I think there has to be a little bit of scoping around some of these issues. But this is definitely where I think conversations, particularly around 5G, are starting to gain some traction. Like, is this a type of infrastructure solution? And it is not perfect. And we sometimes gloss over many of the details around 5G to make these cases. But is this an infrastructure that can provide more utility in terms of reaching into rural areas, or even just solving the kind of urban types of digital divide where people living in the same city, some have incredibly great connectivity and others don't. And you see this with kind of kids migrating to the nearest McDonald's to do their homework, because that's where the Wi-Fi connection is.
There are people who are at obvious disadvantages if they don't have access to the proper technology, and that has all been exacerbated by the pandemic. Are we trending in the right direction? Are we solving these problems?
I would say we are trending in the right direction in terms of recognizing the problems. And I think one of the things that happened around COVID-19, sometimes these get talked about as issues that are either dead or exist outside the United States, right? That the digital divide is not an American problem, that's a global problem. And maybe America can take some leadership in trying to solve it. But I think one of the things COVID-19 really laid bare for us as a country is no, we have not solved these problems. They exist, and they exist in really different ways in different places. And that, like, that kind of diversity of problems is now very front and center, in a way that I think is being discussed much more readily. So at least in the sense of COVID-19 being a flashpoint potentially, I think there's a real positive outcome there, that it's refocusing not just US attention, but global attention on these equity questions around digital issues.
Before we shift gears, I just want to let our viewers and listeners know that if they're interested in more on the digital divide, you can watch that event that I referenced that Melissa moderated last week. The title is The Global Digital Divide, Past, Present, and Future, and you could find it by coming to wilsoncenter.org and searching events under the Science and Technology Innovation Program. So after I've done my plug for your past event, Melissa, I want to ask you about the work you're doing on 5G and related national security concerns. We've seen things about Huawei and other countries even banning them over national security concerns. Can you give us sort of the primer on what are the issues related to 5G and security?
Absolutely. So I think there's sort of a question that almost comes before that, which is like, why do we care? Right? Why is everybody super concerned about 5G and national security? And I think the answer there is that it's critical infrastructure. And you probably heard this term a lot. It's one of those buzzwords, but it basically just means an infrastructure upon which critical daily functioning depends, right? So a lot of businesses, companies, our social, political, even our militaries depend on telecommunications networks to function. And that's how it gets this kind of critical status. 5G pushes that criticality a step further, because of kind of this new change to speed, low latency, and number of connected devices that it can support. And this is where you get that term, the fourth industrial revolution, right? Like, this is going to power the future economies of the world where we're transitioning to. And the reality is, if we're talking about connecting things like automated factories and healthcare, remote surgeries, all of these types of connected devices, the Internet of Things, right, all at once on one network, suddenly this isn't just telecom as we understood it before, but it is how a factory runs and operates. It's how a hospital delivers healthcare to its patients in a very real, immediate sense. So that criticality gets heightened. So I think understanding where 5G sits is really important. In terms of the security concerns, and I think you sort of nail this, if you are watching the news or even the policy space, there's an assumption that this is just about China, right? That the national security concerns for the United States are about China, particularly Huawei and ZTE, these two particular telecom vendor companies. I would push back against that. I think there's two categories of national security concerns. And the first is about a company like China's companies. These are about who builds, deploys, maintains networks. The argument is you don't want an untrustworthy builder building your house and then keeping a copy of your key, or the schematics of your house, knowing exactly how to overcome your security features and get in. And there is a real concern there, right? This is a pure competitor. There's a global geopolitical competition. Those are all completely valid. The part that gets left out, which is where I like to spend a little more of my time because it's less kind of explained in full, is the types of security challenges that relate to 5G, regardless of whether or not there's Chinese vendors in the stack to begin with. And these are primarily security, like cybersecurity and critical infrastructure concerns.
Can I ask you to try to bring this down to sort of a household level in terms of,
Mhm.
because a lot of the language around this discussion of 5G, things like the Internet of Things, it almost sounds
Yes.
mystical or science fiction like. But for the average person, you talk about changing factories, changing hospitals. Could you give us a couple of specific scenarios where something that we're familiar with now is going to look dramatically different?
Yeah. So if you think about Internet of Things in the context of your home, which I think can be quite useful, Internet of Things just means lots of teeny computers that are general purpose computers that happen to be doing one thing at that point in time. So if you have a scale that you weigh yourself on and it connects via Bluetooth, that is an Internet of Things. If you can text or check the temperature in your house while you're away at work and control it, you have Internet of Things in your home, sensors and devices that are connected. And what you probably already picked up on is there's a plethora of this. You get a toothbrush now, right? You head into your local store to buy an electric toothbrush and it has Bluetooth and it speaks to an app and you can program it. It's an Internet of Things device at this point. In the context of what people mean by the fourth industrial revolution, what they're talking about is a step forward on automation. So you've already seen a lot of automation in factories. What the Internet of Things supports, being able to have that number of devices, is a plethora of sensors, for example, that can accurately monitor specific processes down to very minute details and adjust very, very quickly to those processes. Not just the sensors, but then the devices themselves, and all of those things work in concert. And you can do that not just at a few factories, but all the factories at scale. And that requirement of sort of bandwidth, low latency, high speed doesn't exist yet to have that kind of broad. Another example would be a remote surgery, where, say, you are in a rural part of the country that does not currently have access to a world-class surgeon. And you could have that surgeon, part of that surgery, operating machinery in that location through a digital connection. That would be another example. But all of these things, again, are sort of possible in individual cases. At scale requires an infrastructure overhaul.
And so what you described, I could pick up my phone right now, and this is true. I could turn on the air conditioner two floors away in my home,
Yep.
and check the temperature. And that's just one example of what you're talking about. And so what you're saying is that every one of those Wi-Fi connections, every connection to the network to make all these devices run, create vulnerabilities.
Exactly. And it's one of the biggest areas of concern with 5G networks, actually, is if you think about how you would traditionally secure something in physical space, you want to understand your territory. What are you trying to defend? And what are all the access points to your territory? The problem with cyberspace is a broader category, which is where my expertise fits, but then also 5G as a specific network, is that you have an infrastructure that is incredibly large. It's constantly changing every time someone connects a device. And you're a little bit at the kind of mercy of the person connecting that device to the extent to which they have done that in a secure manner. So you've increased the number of endpoints, the access points, the territory you have to defend, and also the number of actors you're relying on to make good resiliency and security decisions.
I think I've talked to airline experts about the problems of chaos and complexity theory as it relates to airlines, and the size of and the amount of flights pre-pandemic that cross the skies every day, and the hub system of these giant airports that serve as a departure point and a connection point for so many, create this vulnerability where bad weather in Atlanta could literally ripple around the globe. Are we talking about a similar scenario here where the chaos and complexity theory of it is that it's way too big and too complex and too overlapping to almost be manageable?
Absolutely. I think you're talking about a couple different things. One is just understanding your space, which is harder to do the larger and more complex it is. And the other is how hard is it to defend something that's complex, right? And I think particularly on how hard it is to defend, there's sort of a turn of phrase in the industry, which is that the defender has to be right almost all the time.
Mm.
And the kind of malicious actor only needs to really get it right once. Right. And then they're able to gain, is specifically if they do that correctly, gain persistence in your network, pivot and move within that network laterally, and gain objectives, whether those are attacks, so disrupting or degrading, or also just espionage operations, gaining information, which is a big concern if you're a telecom, right? When you think about the type of data that transverses telecom networks.
And where are your significant concerns? Is it about infrastructure? Is it about shutting down electrical grids? What are the types of things that keep you up at night?
So I think for me, there's sort of three categories. One is complexity that just leads to accidents. right? So it doesn't take a malicious actor to take an airport offline. I think we saw that in Atlanta, right? It can just simply be bad code, right? Poor best
Mhm.
practices. And the more complex it is, the harder that is. I think the second category I have is espionage. When we think about the amount of data and the quality of that data, the more we connect on these networks, you do become kind of concerned about IP theft, right? And the ways in which that data, the confidentiality of that data can be protected, both from a national security concern, but also as an individual, right? Using those networks to communicate, or a company using these networks to operate their factories. And then the third category is the disruptive attacks. And I think for me, these are the least likely, but also the most concerning. Particularly in the 5G space, simply because when you talk about crippling 5G, this becomes a single point of failure in the same way that electricity does, power in the United States, given so many other sectors that we define as critical infrastructure or services depend on this to function. So if you're looking to cripple a US system more broadly, things like power, things like telecom, and specifically 5G now are particularly concerning areas.
Is this at the proper level of priority for those who are in a position to fortify the defenses?
Unfortunately, I think there's been a preoccupation, at least at the higher national levels in the United States, with chasing the geopolitical ball, the China question. And I can see why that is. It is a simpler narrative, right? China is a
Mhm.
pure competitor. You don't want to give them the keys to your house. Very easy. The cybersecurity critical infrastructure questions, as you're seeing in this conversation, get into technical weeds very quickly. They're harder to sell as a political narrative. But I think the reality is they're the more important question, because even if you exclude Huawei from the network, these vulnerabilities still remain. If you never lock your front door, it doesn't matter if they have your key. They'll open the door anyway.
If you were sort of scoring the U.S. and where we currently sit, and say, I don't know how to scale of 1 to 10, 1 is that the doors are wide open and we are in for trouble if we don't do something about it, and 10 is we've done everything reasonable with the latest technology and we're about as secure as we could possibly be. Where do we sit?
I put us about the middle of the scale, and partially because I do think there's two things happening. There is concern amongst kind of the providers and the operators of these systems about security, and companies that provide security as sort of a consumer grade, what you purchase from them. And they are very worried about the cybersecurity question. I would put us kind of about a 5 though, because I think there's sort of two things happening. One, we haven't grasped the full picture of the 5G security landscape. And two, we never really fixed the issues in the scale or scope that we needed to around 4G. And a lot of the 5G systems are building off those legacy systems. So in terms of critical infrastructure protection, which is one of the really difficult areas to do across whole of society approaches, we're probably kind of middle of the pack, but a lot of countries are middle of the pack. So we're not alone in sort of being moderately mediocre.
Speaking of those other countries, your Wilson Center project, The Mice That Roar, What Small Countries Can Teach Great Powers and About National Cyber Defense, at least the working title. I can read into the titles the suggestion that we could learn some things from some people who are scoring higher than a 5 or a 6. Who are
Yes.
the countries out there that have gotten this right, and what can we learn from them?
Yeah. So I think there's countries that have gotten it more right. There's a joke coming out of Finland that they're a valedictorian, but they're a valedictorian in a class full of dummies. And I think that is important to keep in mind because it does, I think, relate to this problem that nobody is really hitting this out of the park. But I think part of what I'm looking at in that work, in that book project that's ongoing, is saying, what is cyber defense a problem of? Right? So we talk about it sort of in isolation. And I make the argument that it's a societal defense problem, particularly when you look at things like critical infrastructure, of which 5G is one. So you have this issue where you have to defend society in depth. Your society is very vulnerable. It's because you have a lot of connected devices, a lot of interconnectivity around cyberspace. Everything from your energy grid to your toaster is now online. That's a huge attack surface. So there's that component. And then you also need almost all of your society to work in tandem to respond, right? The individual making good cyber hygiene questions, please don't click on that malicious link. I'm sure everyone's got a million trainings on those, all the way up to critical infrastructure protection and working with the actual providers of that infrastructure and the firms that work with them, all the way up to Department of Defense, Cyber Command, NSA. And so you'll hear these kind of whole of government, all of the government, whole of society, all these players, public, private, citizens, government. That problem to the United States is new. We don't have a really vulnerable home base and the need to leverage all of society. If you are a small, precariously placed country, this sounds awfully familiar, right? If you are in Israel, a Finland, a Singapore that have a history of not feeling particularly secure, feeling like your home base is an active area where competition or contest can occur, And because you are small, well, if you're going to effectively defend, you better leverage everyone from your individual citizen all the way up to your government in tandem, whole of society. So part of what that book is looking at is saying, hang on, if you are small and precariously placed, it's a similar problem set than if you are big and sitting in a cyberspace defense world. They're this very similar, which means if you're a country like a Finland, you have pre-existing institutions that you are able to leverage. So Finland, kind of when they first put out their strategies in the early 2010s, reaches out and picks up all of this critical infrastructure language and institutions that predate cyberspace. So NESA, the National Emergency Supply Agency, has all these different pillars. These should sound familiar. Things like energy, healthcare, agriculture, food, right? These are things the United States then had to develop. And they already had in place conversations about how you deal with single points of failure, contagion, what's critical, what do you need to protect if you're in the middle of a conflict? How do you do it? How do you work between these pillars and down these pillars? And the companies were already present. So that's kind of what that project is looking at, is saying, hey, United States, we talk about this as if it's brand new. It's not for a lot of countries in the world. So let's see kind of what they have done and if we can pull best practices.
Are those best practices scalable to a country the size of the US?
$1 million question right there, John. And this is actually where I'm at in that project, is sort of taking the underlying, not the structure. So the United States does not need to build a NESA, for example, or follow what any of these countries, including like in Israel, does, and have a conscription army. Right? That is not going to be a US response to these types of challenges. But what we can do is say, well, what is the functionality of conscripts in Israel around cyber defense? Are there ways we can replicate that functionality in the United States, given our current bureaucratic structures? So you see efforts around this, around setting up cyber national guards in various countries, rapid response forces, and then education initiatives, right? Which is very heavily what a lot of these countries are using their conscription for, is you can train them how to shoot a gun. You can also train them basic cyber hygiene at the exact same time. So it's sort of, I think, scaling that problem up. The real concern for me is that bureaucratically, the United States is a very different country, both in terms of its size, but also the way we structured our defense and just our politics. Like, we are silos built on silos in the United States. So my large concern as somebody watching cyber conflict is that small countries probably are better able to defend their territory in depth in cyberspace than a large country, even though we have massive resources, because of these silos and because of just the territory we're trying to defend. And if that's the case, then these questions of defend forward, get outside our borders, sort of take the fight, the friction outside into other people's networks, seem more and more like the kind of only option the United States may have, which is
Melissa,
not great.
I'm sorry, but as you mentioned, since this is a work in progress, we're just going to have to talk about it again, right? Because this has been incredibly informative. Before we close today, though, I want to ask you about one of these specific silos, election security. Right. As you and I sit here today, we still don't have a president-elect. The votes are still being counted. By the time people see our interview, perhaps that's been settled. But can you do a comparison and contrast between cybersecurity 4 years ago and cybersecurity today around the election? Does it indicate that the U.S. is learning from its mistakes?
Yes. So I actually think if you look at the United States, this is the area we've made the most progress, which I think is telling, right? I think it's because there's a clear threat that is scoped in a way that makes it easier to determine roles and responsibilities versus
that simple narrative that you've talked about.
Exactly. But I think this is where you see the most kind of progress, both in terms of Cyber Command, DoD, NSA, working in tandem with DHS and CISA, which are sort of the more civilian internal sides of these questions. Real sort of, the lawyers have done the paperwork is sort of the joke in determining who has correct roles and responsibilities and what to do if something happens. So you're not trying to figure out the protocol in real time. And I think that's important. But I would say there's two different problems around elections that are happening together. And one is a critical infrastructure problem, and the other is an influence operations problem. And they're not the same problem. I think we have a better grasp of the critical infrastructure problem. And that is election systems, right? How did you register? How did they keep your name on a vote tally? How did they count the votes? How do they announce the votes? How do they verify? All that information is critical infrastructure. And in the United States, we have one big advantage that's also a disadvantage. It's highly disaggregated, right? Which means it is locally held and operated, often on very different machines, location to location. That makes it really hard for a broad-based attack, right, on those systems. It also makes it really hard to bring all those systems up to par where you want them, because you can't send out just single best practices. But there's been a lot of movement in that space, which I think is comforting. The other space, which is less comforting, is the influence operations, which I think there are other people I'm sure you've spoken to at the Wilson Center that specialize in this.
Sure. Our colleagues
But that
are
is a
on
very
this.
different set of questions. And I think that's actually the area we have the most to go in terms of just understanding the problems and also understanding how our systems make it worse and sort of
Well, thank
rectifying
you.
those.
Melissa, thank you. You're a terrific addition to the
Thank you
Science
so
and
much.
Technology Innovation Program. This was fascinating, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your time.
A pleasure. And to our viewers and listeners, we hope you enjoyed this as well and found it informative and will fortify your Internet of Things in your home. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.